We're here for another episode of Clean Tech Talk. And today we're talking with Chris Harto, Senior Energy Policy Analyst at Consumer Reports. And I am Zachary Shahan, Clean Technica CEO. Chris, we just recently met at Electrify Expo in Austin, Texas. It was just, obviously it's always great to connect with another kind of journalist, analyst, kind of, someone in the learn and help write educational pieces field. As a senior energy analyst, you're a bit different from our role, but there's that kindred spirit. There's that like, oh yeah, this is my people. This is what we do. So and it was great. I think you introduced yourself, and we're familiar with Clean Technica, and so thought, hey, let's do a podcast. Have a discussion. And you presented a wonderful, excellent idea on email, I think a few weeks ago, and it's possibly the favorite topic for Clean Technica readers. So it's a perfect discussion topic. So I'll let you introduce it actually. So let's jump in.
Yeah, Zach, happy to be here. Great to be on the podcast. So I've been trying to keep an eye out for any evidence that the demand for ICE vehicles, internal combustion engine gas vehicles, is starting to wane a little bit, even potentially faster than automakers can build up alternative powertrains, hybrids, and especially battery electric vehicle sales. And so I've kind of been on the lookout for evidence of that phenomena showing up.
Yeah, and I think if you know anyone waiting on an electric vehicle, they have a long wait nowadays. My sister waited about a year for a Volkswagen ID4. Saw a guy in the tennis courts who ordered a Model Y, and it was going to take about 9 or 10 months or something. And I think it's just no matter what EV you want, if it's one of the more popular, I guess there might be some fringe ones that few people want that don't have a long waiting list. I'm not sure, but all the top selling ones seem to have a long wait list. So you pointed this out, and you wanted to talk about that a little bit beyond just, oh yeah, there's a lot of demand, or there's a supply chain issue, which is often the kind of excuse that automakers have put out. It's like, oh, we don't have enough automotive chips or something.
Yeah. The supply chain crisis has definitely been a common excuse over the past few years from the automakers. Certainly, there are supply chain challenges, but it seems like there's especially in the clean vehicle space, it's just really hard to find a vehicle. You drive by dealers and they have plenty of gasoline pickup trucks to sell you. But if you want a hybrid, if you want a plug-in hybrid, especially if you want a BEV, there's none on the lot. You can't get one. If they do have one on the lot, it's often marked up really high. $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 even hasn't been uncommon in the past year or two for really popular BEVs. And so it really seems like, automakers just aren't delivering enough of these vehicles. Consumer demand is strong, and, it seems to be pulling away demand from their conventional ICE vehicles that they want to try and sell you so they can build up those profits to help transition to EVs.
Yeah, I think we'll come back to that in a moment, the famous the Osborne effect. But just first of all, I think we'll take it back globally a bit first. So I think we're probably thinking the US because we're American,
Yep.
but it's the same problem in Europe. China, I'm not sure if it's having this problem as much, but it's very unique. It's a unique market that does more than half of the global EV sales, but a lot of Chinese automakers, very few foreign automakers have a good foothold there. And in Europe, just the sales are much higher than the US. The adoption rate is around 20% instead of around 6%. And we had a writer point out a while back that the US is just going to be last priority, because you have China, which is a huge market that is hot as about as hot as Europe. You've got Europe, which is requiring automakers to sell enough EVs to have a low enough, emissions average that they don't get big fines. So they have to sell there to not get fined a lot. And in the US, there's not so much, there's no real require. I mean, there's a bit in California and associated ZEV states, but there's not nearly the kind of the pressure, the demand, the requirement to sell a large portion of EVs. So have you looked at that at all? Have you thought about that and sort of the what role that plays in this long wait list in the US?
Yeah, absolutely. Traditionally, automakers have always, unfortunately, tended to do the bare minimum required by them by law. So whatever the standards say, they will meet those standards, but they almost never historically have gone beyond the standards. And when I say the standards, I mean the EPA greenhouse gas standards and the NHTSA CAFE standards, which regulate emissions and efficiency for vehicles in the US. Actually, under the Trump administration, they really rolled back those standards for model years 2021 and 2022. So for those two model years, automakers have to do almost nothing. So the
The
standards,
Trump administration lowered standards for clean cars.
yeah,
I'm
I know
shocked.
it's very shocking. And so yeah, the Biden administration came in and put in tougher standards again, but those standards don't go into they start in model year 2023, which is what we're really just starting to see model year 2023 vehicles. But even then, those standards only require around 16-17% EV sales in 2026. So if automakers are targeting those numbers, we're looking at a relatively slow ramp of their BEV production, and that's likely to leave a lot of consumers who want these vehicles waiting longer than they would like to get those vehicles. Because again, automakers have a tendency, in the past at least, to do only what's required by law, but only what's required by law. And so
That's interesting that I wasn't familiar with that 16 to 17% 2026 figure. That's basically what the standards are going to require. I mean, of course, that assumes what they're selling. I mean, that makes an assumption about how many they're selling overall, right?
Yeah.
Or I'm not sure if it's relative completely, but just on that topic, there was also the California case where California, since the Clean Air Act, has had the right to have higher standards for vehicles than the US at large, and Trump tried to remove that right, and there was this big fight. And it was we don't want to go down that road for too long, but it was interesting to me because there were some automakers, I think it was GM and some others, who were sort of fighting on the Trump side of, why does California have the right to make sure that its air is clean? and then Ford, I think, sided or at least stayed out of it, but maybe sided with the EPA, the historical right to have cleaner air. But aside from California and that fight, the same thing sort of happened in Europe. And I remember years ago, like 6 or 7 years ago, maybe it was, where it seemed like German automakers were putting a lot of pressure on Merkel to modify these rules that were coming into place in the past couple of years, but were years out still. And they had been, decided even years before that, but there was this pressure, and the sort of the argument was, people are not going to buy these. There's not enough demand. If you make us do this, we're going to die. And with politics and lobbying, you only get a piece of what's happened, but it seemed clear enough that was what was going on. And the Model 3 came out, Tesla Model 3 came out, and just exploded. People, the demand right off the bat for that was so big that I think it gave Merkel and others, I'm talking about Angela Merkel, former Prime Minister of Germany for a long time, it gave them the kind of the ability to say, wait a second, you're saying there's not demand, but look at all this demand for this vehicle. You can't make a better vehicle? Like come on, you're Mercedes, you're BMW, you're Volkswagen. Like, if you can't have this level of demand, you've got a problem that's not, it's not what you're telling me. So I think that, a lot of fans of the German auto industry might disagree and say, no, 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 they were always going to do it. I don't think they were. And I think it was that pressure. And then once they realized, okay, we're not going to get the more lenient rules in Europe, and we're going to have to compete. Then they started producing these vehicles that have now these very big wait lists. I don't know, is
Yeah,
that your take? You want to chime in on
yeah,
that?
exactly. I feel like there was really a phase transition that took place somewhat soon after the Model 3 hit the market. Before the Model 3, pretty much every non-Tesla vehicle on the market was a compliance car. These were cars that they built the bare minimum of to meet emission standards, and specifically those standards you mentioned in California, the ZEV standards in California that required a certain relative fairly small number of ZEVs, but they did have to build some ZEVs, and so yeah, it was all compliance cars. Those cars were crap. They were small. They had short range. Sorry to anybody who loves their 2012 Leaf. I think those vehicles have a place. They're not mass market vehicles. They're not vehicles that are going to catch the attention of most of the American public. You started to see some slightly better vehicles coming out in the late teens, after the Model 3. You had the Bolt, you had the Kona, you had some of these vehicles that were starting to get to what a consumer really needs, the over 200 miles of range, slightly faster charging. But it's really the vehicles that automakers started developing as they saw the Model 3 and the demand for the Model 3. Those development time cycles take 3, 4, 5 years to get from, oh crap, we need to actually build a really good EV to compete with Tesla, to we actually have a vehicle on the road that's been designed, been tested, and manufacturing's been built up. So we're starting to see those vehicles, but these are really the first vehicles that automakers have really tried to sell a compelling vehicle to consumers. Vehicles like the Mach-E, the ID.4, the EV6, the Ioniq 5, the Nissan Ariya. All of these vehicles are really the first time automakers have tried. And I think it really did legitimately catch a lot of these automakers by surprise, that if they build a really good, compelling EV, consumers will want it. And I don't know why they were surprised, but they clearly were. They weren't planning for this. They weren't expecting this tsunami of demand to develop when they actually built a better car.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I 100% the same page, I think. And I'm not sure if it was it John Volcker who coined the phrase compliance cars. I'm not sure. It's been used for
Yeah,
years now.
yeah,
Might have been John Volcker, but it's the idea that the automakers were only building the cars that they had to meet regulations. And the funny thing was, automakers would sometimes say, this is not a compliance car. I swear, this is not a compliance car. And then it would just barely meet the
yeah,
sales target that they needed. It was like, well, it sure, if it walks like if it drives like if it
yeah,
but I mean, some automakers were more outright. Fiat, the late Sergio Marchionne was like, don't buy our cars, we don't want to make them, we have to. Like, we lose money on these cars, this kind of argument. But
yeah,
but this I remember too, when Kia brought the Soul EV to the market. Again, it's early stage. It was really not that competitive at all with range and stuff yet. But they were like, wow, we really were surprised how many people wanted to buy this vehicle. Like,
yeah,
and I think started getting a little more serious. But Hyundai and Kia have always led in designing, developing really good EVs, but I think have always been way too pessimistic with what they expect consumers, how many consumers they expect to want them. And I think that's even carried through with the EV6 and the Ioniq 5, which have been built in that new phase of, okay, we're going to really build an EV, we're going to do our best, and we're going to really try to sell it. But I think it's still very much underestimated demand.
yeah, absolutely. I've had my eye on the EV6 since it came out, and it's you can't find one, and when you find one, it has a really high markup, or it has, up until now. I haven't looked in the past few months since the changes in the tax credits, but
Well, I
yeah,
I was going to bring that up earlier, and I have also like that's so that I have a Model 3, and this is the EV6 has really tempted me, and the Ioniq 5 as well, as we got to more familiar with it, and I see them on the road around me here. We have quite good EV adoption, and I'm just like, man, that's really nice. I like that, But and one of our writers got an Ioniq 5, absolutely loves it. But I was going to bring up the EV6 earlier because it was, I think, 3 or 4 months ago, where there was a radio ad playing from Kia. I think Kia saying, come buy that EV6. We have them on the lot, and they repeated like 4 times an ad. They're on the lot. We have them on the lot, and I was like, geez, this is like, everyone was aware that it was hard to find the EV on the lot. The markups were crazy, and they were blasting on the ad. Like half of the time on the ad was just, we have them on the lot. Like, and I was like, wow, this is really abnormal. This is something else
yeah,
going on here. And that was not a question. Great interviewing skills. No, I'm just, but yeah, no, I think
okay.
I was just gonna, Hyundai and Kia clearly have been developing compelling EVs now. And Ford was another interesting story or case you brought up, where they didn't really have any. I mean, the Ford Focus Electric was sort of a joke because they had a video out how they developed it, and they're like, oh yeah, we just engineers came to it. We just decided, hey, we'll just put a box here where the batteries could go in the trunk, and it's electric. And it was like, well, that's the level of effort they put into it. But then once they got serious, they formed this kind of internal startup, which they called Team Edison initially. I'm not sure if I don't think it's still called that. And they were like, just build the best EVs you can, do whatever you want, anything. And they used their biggest names, the Mustang name and the F-150, biggest brands, and they built really compelling EVs. And you just see that was a new part of that new phase where, like, okay, we're going to really try to build the best EV. And they're highly competitive. We had a poll recently where respondents to the poll preferred the Mustang Mach-E over the Model Y, and the Model Y is clearly a much higher seller. And but it sort of gives an indication of, maybe if Ford could produce 500,000 Mustang Mach-E's and really push them, maybe they could sell, a lot more than we realize today. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, certainly all every EV made right now is massively production limited, supply limited. Yeah, again, we were talking about the EV6 earlier. I think they sold on the order of 17, 20, less than 20,000 last year. They could sell 2, 3 times that many if they built them and sent them here. I know, an automaker like Kia is trying to manage their vehicles to multiple markets. So, the demand in Europe is really high, demand in the US is really high. I'm sure they have demand other places in the world that's really high. And so they're struggling to catch up with consumer demand. And they really just massively underestimated how many
Yeah.
people would want to buy these cars.
Yeah, I'm sure even in the home market of Korea, which has been popping,
Yeah.
and then we don't even talk hardly about these more emerging, developing markets where they also want EVs. We get readers like, we
Yeah.
want EVs badly. We talk to everyone, we can't get them to bring EVs to our market, like Colombia or somewhere like this. And it was like, yeah, I know this is this is a problem. But again, we're just highlighting that this is kind of the first phase of serious efforts. It takes 6 to 8 years or something to develop a new vehicle. And so even the level of demand we're seeing for these right now is great. But imagine like a second wave, which
Yeah.
Volkswagen Group's sort of getting into, where they've refined their ability to develop EV, where they've learned a lot, and they're, at that stage where they're like, okay, we're going to be able to do 500,000 of these if we do well. And so I think we're going to roll into that. There's still the whole battery supply issue, which I'm not even going to talk about that today. That's a whole different. But
Yeah.
but on the topic of consumer demand, when you see that demand for current EVs, you think about the next phase of EVs, next era, next wave. You get to this other issue, which is dropping ICE demand. So
Yeah, absolutely. And just a few quick stats on that consumer demand piece. We did a survey on EVs and low carbon fuels over the summer, released that, and the headline numbers weren't that eye popping. It was around 14% of Americans. This is a nationally representative survey. 14% of Americans said they would definitely buy a battery electric vehicle if they were to buy a vehicle today. And then a total of 36% of Americans, including those 14% who said they would definitely buy, said they would seriously consider a battery electric vehicle. And when we're talking about targets of 50% sales and all of that, people think, okay, 14%, it's not that much higher than the 6% that we're seeing in sales. But actually, when you look at the vehicle fleet and the vehicles in people's driveways, that 14% of Americans who would buy an EV today is 36 million Americans who are ready to pull the trigger on an electric vehicle. And automakers, I believe, delivered around 800,000 electric vehicles last year. So when you see that mismatch,
35.2 million below the demand. And you said
exactly.
They said definitely, right?
Definitely. They said definitely
Jeez.
would buy. And when you look at even the 50% by 2030 figure that's out there a lot, you don't meet the demand for those 36 million Americans who want an EV today on that 50% path until somewhere between 2030 and 2031. So even the people who want an EV today, not assuming that, as EVs get better, more people are going to want them, as more people drive them, more people want them, just the people who want them today, we're not going to meet that demand for another roughly 8 years. And that puts into context like how long people are probably going to be sitting and waiting for these vehicles.
Yeah, and so I think we can end with that hot topic of the Osborne effect. So when people are waiting for the next model or the next technology, they will then delay a purchase if it's not ready. So there's a kind of I've often said, I've said many times, Tesla, sure, they had a very hard path to financial sustainability, profitability, but legacy automakers have to surf like this ridiculously high, difficult wave on like a needle, because they have to ramp up EV production and demand. I mean, they have to stimulate it as well. I mean, they have almost every car commercial I see now is for EVs. So they're clearly focused on we need to be seen as the EV brand in the next decade. But beyond that, they have to then scale down their production of gas mobiles or fossil fuel powered vehicles, which is a whole other challenge. And I mean, and timing that just right, it's like, I wouldn't want to be responsible for that, because I don't feel like I don't feel like it's even really possible I mean, you can do it, but it's going to always be create problems and be difficult. So I don't know. What do you have to say about how they're dealing with that and what to expect? With the
I mean, it's extremely challenging. You're dealing with two essentially exponential processes happening at the same time, and you're trying to optimize to hit for those two things to cross at the same point. Like I do not envy automakers one bit in the challenge that they have, but also consumers don't care. Like you've shown me this awesome product. I want it. Build it for me, and give it to me, and don't try to sell me the old obsolete stuff that I don't want anymore. I very much appreciate their challenge, and also it doesn't matter.
We often talk about the ruthlessness of corporations and capitalism, but actually there's a ruthlessness of the consumer as well. It's like you either get what you want, what I want, or goodbye. Like, you can go out of business. I don't care. There's a real. It's an interesting way you put it there.
Yeah, and I'll throw out a stat. And I was just at a conference with a bunch of automakers, and I told this to everyone that I spoke to. We in addition to this EV survey, we have a regular car buying survey. This survey is only people planning to buy a new vehicle to them, not necessarily a new or used vehicle, in the next year, next 12 months. So and in that survey, among just the people who said they were only buying new cars, and new cars are really the only ones that matter here in terms of the initial development and penetration of electric vehicles. Of those people who said they were only looking for a new car, 34% said they weren't looking for a conventional ICE vehicle. So those people might have been looking for some combination of a hybrid, plug-in hybrid, or battery electric vehicle. So a third of the market, a third of potential new car buyers aren't looking at conventional ICE vehicles. That number doubled in the past 2 years. So it went from 17% to 34% in the past 2 years. Who knows what it's going to be 2 years from now?
That data must have been end of 2022, right?
Yeah, it was middle of 2022.
Middle of 2022.
Yeah.
That's
So
8 years off from 2050, where the goal is 50%, and
yeah,
that's often sort of the more ambitious forecasts.
yeah. So
It
even
just
if it's yeah, there's the trajectory is not looking good for a lot of these automakers' plans in which they assume that they will be able to easily sell 50%, $45,000 gas SUVs that get, in the low 20s in fuel economy in 8 years. I think that's a question they need to be asking themselves internally. In 8 years, when we have better infrastructure, there's $7.5 billion being invested in infrastructure. There's tax credits. EVs are getting better every generation. Battery prices, barring supply chain crises, are trending down. So the prices of these vehicles are trending down. Economies of scale are going to continue to kick in and make these vehicles more and more affordable. So all of these dynamics are taking place to the point where, looking out at 2030, the infrastructure problem is going to be a lot less. The vehicle prices should be at parity or better in 2030. A lot of analyses show EVs being cheaper well before 2030, but definitely by 2030.
not
And
even
so the
taking
question
total cost,
becomes like,
not even considering total cost of ownership, because
yeah, not even considering the massive savings in fuel and maintenance, just purchase price. And so the question becomes, who is this population of people who are going to buy new gasoline SUVs that have poor fuel economy in 2030 when they can buy a BEV that has 300 miles of range or more, that has instant torque, has better performance, has lower fuel cost, has lower maintenance cost, it charges faster, and yeah, it just I question
just better.
that. Yeah, it's just
Yeah.
better.
And so it just stimulates a couple more final things too.
Yeah.
So I think you mentioned something about the inventory growing on dealerships already right now. Do you have stats on that, or just as general?
I don't have off the top of my head stats on inventory, but
We can include them in the article maybe if you have.
Certainly, the analysts that analyze these sorts of things have shown growing inventories over the past 3 or 4 months. The inventories are still way down. Gas vehicle supplies are still low relative to historic norms, but last year gasoline vehicle sales dropped around 11%, and some of that supply chain crisis, but some of it may be the 2 to 3 million people sitting on wait lists for electric vehicles that might have purchased a vehicle but are waiting for that BEV that they want to be manufactured and delivered.
Yeah, I do quarterly U.S. auto industry reports looking at total sales of all the auto brands. A few niche ones don't report, like Jaguar, Land Rover, but but what we do different from a lot of the news outlets is we've been comparing to 2019, 2020, 2021, and now we also 2022, sort of because of COVID and everything going on in the supply chain. It's, looking 1 year or comparing one year over year numbers is not really as helpful as the long term. And when you do it going back to 2019, 2020, it's just like, wow, there's some serious bleeding going on. I mean, there's some like constant large declines. So there's a lot more going on there than the common narrative, which is what you highlighted and why we did the show. But one more final thing, then, we talked about how difficult it is for automakers. A couple of automakers are being more aggressive. So Volvo, I think, wants to be fully electric by 2030, if I remember correctly. BYD, which was producing conventional fossil fuel vehicles before, last year they switched to only producing plug-in vehicles around March or April or May or something. So now since then they only produce plug-in hybrids or full electrics, and that they're even trending more full electrics. And in China, where they sell their vehicles mostly, but now they're getting very global. The plug-in hybrids often have like 40-50 miles of range, so they're not these wimpy plug-in hybrids that a lot of people criticize, but serious. They can be BEV most of the time. So what's your recommendation to legacy automakers in that context? Is it like just sprint to 100% electric as quickly as possible by 2030 if you can, so that you're not faced with this crisis of having millions of fossil fuel vehicles that nobody wants to buy? Or I mean, obviously it's easier for Volvo because it's smaller than a lot of these other companies. BYD's in China, where there's a little more clarity what's going on from the federal government. But if you're in the elevator with a few automaker CEOs, and they treat you like, oh wow, Chris Harto, can you tell us how do we survive this? What's your idea?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that the risks have really flipped from the traditional narrative of what if we move too fast and consumer demand isn't there. Really, all of the risk now is on the side of moving too slow. So I don't see a path where an automaker massively outruns consumer demand in their EV push. Basically, as fast as you can feasibly make that transition, do it, and you won't regret it. The automakers that are probably going to regret it are the ones that move the slowest.
I love those two. First, the risk, considering it in the context, just overall risk as a risk analysis. That's a great way to look at it. And then, like you said, probably no one's going to move too fast, right? So,
yeah.
Love it. Thanks a lot. That was a fun chat, and I love when 100% line up with the other person, and also when you talk to someone where you know that you've been deep in the weeds of this industry for a decade or more. It's like, oh yeah, we've gone through all these different phases, and we've seen the story. So really appreciate Chris being on here. Keep up the good work at Consumer Reports. Let us know what you're doing. In the article, we'll try to include any extra stats or facts that we might have missed. And of course, if you're listening, please like us, subscribe on Spotify, on YouTube if you're on YouTube, on iTunes, wherever you are. Please don't forget to give us a heart or a star or whatever it is on that platform, and subscribe for more shows like this. Thank you. And Chris, any final words?
Yeah, it's just going to be a really exciting decade, I think. A lot of cool stuff happening, and really excited to see it all play out.
Yep. Thank you. Have a good day.